Selim III was the reform-minded Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1789 to 1807. The Janissaries eventually deposed and imprisoned him, and placed his cousin Mustafa on the throne as Mustafa IV. Selim was killed by a group of assassins subsequently after a Janissary Revolt. Biography and Family. Selim III was the son of Sultan Mustafa III and his wife Janissary Sultan. His mother, Janissary Valide Sultan, originated in Georgia, and when she became the Valide Sultan, she participated in reforming the government schools and establishing political corporations. His father, Ottoman Sultan Mustafa III, was very well educated and believed in the necessity of reforms. Mustafa III attempted to create a powerful army during the peacetime with professional, well-educated soldiers. This was primarily motivated by his fear of a Russian invasion. During the Turco-Russian War he fell ill and died of a heart attack in 1774. Sultan Mustafa was aware of the fact that a military reform was necessary. He declared new military regulations and opened maritime and artillery academies. Sultan Mustafa was very influenced by mysticism. Oracles predicted his son Selim would be a world conqueror, so he organized a joyous feast lasting 7 days. Selim was very well educated in the palace. Sultan Mustafa III bequeathed his son as his successor. However, Selim's uncle Abdülhamid I ascended the throne after Mustafa's death. Sultan Abdülhamid I took care of Selim and put great emphasis on his education. After Abdülhamid's death, Selim succeeded him on 7 April 1789, in his 28th year. Sultan Selim III was very fond of literature and calligraphy. Many of his works were put on the walls of mosques and convents. He wrote many poems, especially about Crimea's occupation by Russia. He spoke Arabic and Persian fluently. Selim III was very religious, and very patriotic. He was a poet, a musician and very fond of fine arts. Selim was a very modern man and a reformist ruler. He planned to modernize the Ottoman Empire. Prince Selim developed plans for modernizing the Ottoman army. Selim came to the throne during the 1787–92 war with Austria and Russia, and had to postpone serious reform efforts until its completion. Selim's early efforts to modernize the Janissary Corps created such opposition that thereafter he concentrated on creating a new European-style army, using modern weapons and European tactics. Officers and military experts sent by the different European powers trained in Constantinople and in a number of Anatolian provincial centers. This new force never numbered more than 10,000 active soldiers. In order to avoid disrupting the established Ottoman institutions, it was financed by an entirely new treasury whose revenues came from taxes imposed on previously untaxed sources and from the confiscation whose holders were not fulfilling their military and administrative duties to the state. Under the guidance of European technicians, factories were erected to manufacture modern weapons and ammunition, and technical schools were opened to train Ottoman officers. Limited efforts were also made to rationalize the Ottoman administrative machinery, but largely along traditional lines. The older military corps, however, remained intact and hostile to the new force, and Selim was therefore compelled to limit its size and use. Selim III left the throne to Mustafa on 29 May 1807. A year and 2 months later he was killed by Alemdar Pasha under the order of Selim's cousin and successor, Mustafa IV. He was buried in Laleli Mosque near his father's tomb. Selim had 15 wives: Nefazar Kadin Efendi, Husnima Kadin Efendi, Zibafa Kadin Efendi, Hafitab Kadin Efendi, Rifat Kadin Efendi, Nurasams Kadin Efendi, Gonkanagar Kadin Efendi, Dimhos Kadin Efendi, Tabasafa Kadin Efendi, Marbub Kadin Efendi, Inasafa Kadin Efendi, Marim Hanım Efendi, Myriban Hanım Efendi. Fatma Ferasahan Hanım Efendi reign. Reforms. He was a son of Mustafa III and succeeded his uncle Abdülhamid I. He was born in Constantinople. His mother was Valide Sultan Mihri Shah. The talents and energy with which Selim III was endowed had endeared him to the people, and great hopes were founded on his accession. He had associated much with foreigners, and was thoroughly persuaded of the necessity of reforming his state. However, Austria and Russia gave him no time for anything but defense, and it was not until the Peace of Iasi that a breathing space was allowed him in Europe. While Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and Syria soon called for Turkey's strongest efforts, Selim III profited by the respite to abolish the military tenure of fiefs. He introduced salutary reforms into the administration, especially in the fiscal department, sought by well-considered plans to extend the spread of education, and engaged foreign officers as instructors, by whom a small corps of new troops called Nizami Jadid were collected and drilled. So well were these troops organized that they were able to hold their own against rebellious Janissaries in the Balkan provinces, such as the Sanjak of Smederevo against its appointed vizier Haji Mustafa Pasha, where disaffected governors made no scruple of attempting to make use of them against the reforming sultan. Emboldened by this success, Selim III issued an order that in future picked men should be taken annually from the Janissaries to serve in the Nizami Jadid. Reforms in law. Selim introduced domestic reforms to strengthen his government. He solicited suggestions throughout the governing institutions. As a basis for change, he created a new treasury, filled in large part from confiscatory punishment leveled at fief holders who had ceased to respect their military obligations. Schools were opened. Attention was given to printing and to the circulation of Western translations, and young Turks were sent to Europe for further study. The most significant reforms, however, involved the military. The navy was strengthened, and a navigation school was opened. The army commissariat was changed, officer training was improved, the Bosphorus forts were strengthened, the artillery was revitalized, and the new engineering school was reorganized. The major innovation was the founding of a new body of regular troops known as the Nizami Cedid, a term also applied to the reforms as a whole. A former Turkish lieutenant in the Russian army formed the first of these new units, uniformed, well-disciplined and drilled, in 1792. Other units followed, involving, in some instances, extensive barracks building with related town facilities, such as the mosques and baths of Scutari. Such buildings constitute Selim's major architectural legacy. Before the reforms, education in the Ottoman Empire had not been a state responsibility but had been provided by the Education for Muslims. The first inroads into the system had been made with the creation of naval engineering, military engineering, medical and military science colleges. In this way, specialized Western-type training was grafted onto the traditional system to produce specialists for the army. Similar institutions for diplomats and administrators were founded, including the Translation Bureau and the Civil Service School. The latter was reorganized and eventually became the Political Science Department of the University of Ankara and the major training center for higher civil servants. The first comprehensive plan for state education was put forward. It provided for a complete system of primary and secondary schools leading to the university level, all under the Ministry of Education. A still more ambitious educational plan, inaugurated in 1869, provided for free and compulsory primary education. Both schemes progressed slowly because of a lack of money, but they provided a framework within which development toward a systematic, secular educational program could take place. There were more than 36,000 Ottoman schools, although the great majority were small, traditional primary schools. The development of the state system was aided by the example of progress among the non-Muslim millet schools. in which the education provided was more modern than in the Ottoman schools, included more than 1,800 Greek schools with about 185,000 pupils and some 800 Armenian schools with more than 81,000 pupils. 2. Non-Muslims also used schools provided by foreign missionary groups in the empire. Foreign relations on the international scene all remained peaceful until 1798, although foreign affairs received considerable attention. Selim realized the importance of diplomatic relations with other nations, and pushed for permanent embassies in the courts of all the great nations of Europe, a hard task because of religious prejudice towards Muslims. Even with the religious obstacles, resident embassies were established in Britain, France, Prussia and Austria. Selim, a cultured poet and musician, carried on an extended correspondence with Louis XVI. Although distressed by the establishment of the Republic in France, Ottoman government was soothed by French representatives in Constantinople who maintained the goodwill of various influential personages. On 1 July 1798, however, French forces landed in Egypt, and Selim declared war on France. In alliance with Russia and Britain, the Turks were in periodic conflict with the French on both land and sea until March 1801. Peace came in June 1802. The following year brought trouble in the Balkans. For decades a sultan's word had no power in outlying provinces, prompting Selim's reforms of the military in order to reimpose central control. This desire was not fulfilled. One rebellious leader was Austrian-backed Osman Patsvantiglu, whose invasion of Wallachia in 1801 inspired Russian intervention, resulting in greater autonomy for the Danubian provinces. Serbian conditions also deteriorated. They took a fateful turn with the return of the hated Janissaries, ousted 8 years before. These forces murdered Selim's enlightened governor, ending the best rule this province had had in the last 100 years. Neither arms nor diplomacy could restore Ottoman authority. French influence with the Sublime Porte did not revive, but it then led the Sultan into defying both St. Petersburg and London, and Turkey joined Napoleon's continental system. War was declared on Russia on 27 December and on Britain in March 1807. Janissary Revolt. The Sultan's most ambitious military project was the creation of an entirely new infantry corps fully trained and equipped according to the latest European standards. This unit, called the Nizam-i-Jadid, was formed in 1797 and adopted a pattern of recruitment that was uncommon for the imperial forces. It was composed of Turkish peasant youths from Anatolia, a clear indication that the Devshirme system was no longer functional. Officered and trained by Europeans, the Nizam-i-Jadid was outfitted with modern weapons and French-style uniforms. By 1806 the new army numbered around 23,000 troops, including a modern artillery corps, and its units performed effectively in minor actions. But Selim II's inability to integrate the force with the regular army and his reluctance to deploy it against his domestic opponents limited its role in defending the state it was created to preserve. From the start of Selim's reign, the Janissaries had viewed this entire program of military reform as a threat to their independence, and they refused to serve alongside the new army in the field. The powerful Derebis were alarmed by the way in which the Sultan financed his new forces. He confiscated timar and directed the other revenue toward the Nizam-i-Jadid. Further opposition came from the ulama and other members of the ruling elite who objected to the European models on which Selim based his military reforms. Led by the rebellious Janissaries, these forces came together in 1806, deposed Selim III, and selected a successor, Mustafa IV, who pledged not to interfere with their privileges. The decree of deposition accused Selim III of failing to respect the religion of Islam and the tradition of the Ottomans. Over the course of the next year, the embassies in Europe were dismantled, the Nizami-Jadid troops were dispersed, and the deposed Sultan, whose cautious military reforms were intended to do no more than preserve the tradition of the Ottomans, was murdered. Austro-Turkish War. The Austro-Turkish War of 1787 was an inconclusive struggle between the Austrian and Ottoman empires. It took place concomitantly with the Russo-Turkish War of 1787 to 1792 during the reign of the Ottoman Sultan Selim III. Russo-Turkish War. The first major Russo-Turkish War began after Turkey demanded that Russia's ruler, Catherine II the Great, abstain from interfering in Poland's internal affairs. The Russians went on to win impressive victories over the Turks. They captured Azov, the Crimea, and Bessarabia, and under Field Marshal Pyotr Rumyanziev they overran Moldavia and also defeated the Turks in Bulgaria. The Turks were compelled to seek peace, which was concluded in the Treaty of Kukuk-Kaynarca. This treaty made the Crimean Khanate independent of the Turkish Sultan, advanced the Russian frontier. Russia was now in a much stronger position to expand, and in 1783 Catherine annexed the Crimean Peninsula outright. War broke out in 1787, with Austria again on the side of Russia. Under General Alexander Suvorov, the Russians won several victories that gave them control of the lower Dniester and Danube rivers, and further Russian successes compelled the Turks to sign the Treaty of Jassy on 9 January, 1792. By this treaty Turkey ceded the entire western Ukrainian Black Sea coast to Russia. When Turkey deposed the Russophile governors of Moldavia and Wallachia in 1806, war broke out again, though in a desultory fashion, since Russia was reluctant to concentrate large forces against Turkey while its relations with Napoleonic France were so uncertain. But in 1811, with the prospect of a war between France and Russia in sight, the latter sought a quick decision on its southern frontier. The Russian Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov's victorious campaign of 1811–12 forced the Turks to sign the Treaty of Bucharest on 18 May 1812, ending the war that had begun in 1806. This peace agreement established the Ottoman cession of Bessarabia to Russia. The Russians also secured amnesty and a promise of autonomy for the Serbs, who had been rebelling against Turkish rule. But Turkish garrisons were given control of the Serbian fortresses. Implementation of the treaty was forestalled by a number of disputes, and Turkish troops invaded Serbia again the following year. Relations with Tipu Sultan. Tipu Sultan was an independent ruler of the Sultanate of Mysore, with high regards of loyalty to the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. He had urgently requested Ottoman assistance during the Third Anglo-Mysore War, in which he had suffered an irreversible defeat. Tipu Sultan then began to consolidate his relations with France. In an attempt to junction with Tipu Sultan, Napoleon invaded Ottoman Egypt in the year 1798, causing a furore in Constantinople. The British then appealed to Selim III to send a letter to Tipu Sultan requesting the Sultanate of Mysore to halt its state of war against the British East India Company. Selim III then wrote a letter to Tipu Sultan criticizing the French, and also informed Tipu Sultan that the Ottomans would act as intermediary between the Sultanate of Mysore and the British. Tipu Sultan wrote twice to Selim III, rejecting the advice of the Ottomans, unfortunately before most of his letters could arrive in Constantinople. The Fourth Anglo-Mysore War broke out and Tipu Sultan was killed during the siege of Seringapatam. Downfall and assassination. Selim III was, however, thoroughly under the influence of French ambassador to the Porte Horace Sebastiani, and the fleet was compelled to retire without affecting its purpose. But the anarchy, manifest or latent, existing throughout the provinces proved too great for Selim III to cope with. The Janissaries rose once more in revolt, induced the Sheikh ul-Islam to grant a fatwa against the reforms, dethroned and imprisoned Selim III, and placed his cousin Mustafa on the throne, as Mustafa IV. The Ayan of Russo-Turkish, Alemdar Mustafa, a strong partisan of the reforms, collected an army of 40,000 men and marched on Constantinople with the purpose of reinstating Selim III, but he came too late. The ill-fated reforming sultan had been stabbed in the seraglio by the chief black eunuch and his men. Upon his arrival in the capital, Bayraktar's only resource was to wreak his vengeance on Mustafa IV and to place on the throne Mahmud II, the sole surviving member of the House of Osman. Another version about his murder states that at the time of his deposition, Selim was staying at the harem. The night of Thursday, 28 July 1808, he was with his favorite lady, Rifat Kadın Efendi, and a slave girl or perhaps another favorite Pakiza Hanım in attendance. Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, a loyalist of Selim, was approaching the city with his army to reinstate Selim. Therefore Mustafa IV gave orders to murder him and his brother Prince Mahmud. The assassins were apparently a group of men, including the master of the wardrobe, called Feta the Georgian, the treasury steward Eba Selim, and black eunuch named Nezir Aga. Selim apparently knew his end was coming when he saw their swords drawn. Pakiza Hanım Efendi threw herself between him and her lord. She was cut in her hand. Rifat Kadın Efendi started screaming in terror. Another slave girl who rushed in fainted when she saw what was about to happen. A struggle ensued and the former sultan was cut down and murdered, his last words apparently being, "Allahu Akbar." Rifat Kadın Efendi threw herself on the body but was dragged away. The body was quickly wrapped in a quilt. The assassins moved on to find Prince Mahmud and attempt to murder him too. He was more fortunate though and later ordered the assassins to be executed. Selim III would be the only Ottoman sultan to be killed by the sword. He died in Constantinople.